If you were asked who saved Britain from financial collapse in 1797, most people would guess Parliament, or the King, or perhaps the Bank of England itself. Few would mention the name Henry Thornton, the banker who understood what nobody else did, that sometimes the rules designed to protect an economy are exactly what will destroy it. Before Britain became the world's financial superpower, before the pound became the currency empires measured themselves against, before London controlled global capital flows, there was a moment when the entire system nearly imploded. Not from war, not from revolution, from fear itself. The man who saw this clearly wasn't a general, wasn't a politician, wasn't even a traditional banker. He was an evangelical Christian who believed in mathematical truth and moral duty in equal measure. Welcome to the Finance History, where we explore the moments that shaped the way money moves, power accumulates, and history gets written by those who control the ledger. Henry Thornton's genius wasn't in following economic orthodoxy. It was in recognizing when orthodoxy becomes suicide. To understand what he did, you need to understand the crisis he faced. Not the textbook version, not the sanitized account. The actual panic that nearly destroyed British finance in a matter of weeks. February 1797. Britain is at war with revolutionary France. The conflict is draining resources. The government is borrowing heavily. Public anxiety is rising. And then something breaks. A rumor spreads that French forces are preparing to land on British shores. It doesn't matter that the rumor is false. What matters is that people believe it might be true. Within days, depositors begin withdrawing gold from banks. Not because banks are failing, because people are terrified. They want something tangible, something they can hide, move, protect. The withdrawals accelerate. Bank after bank faces the same problem. Their assets are sound, their loans are good, but their gold is walking out the door faster than they can recall debts or liquidate holdings. This is a liquidity crisis in its purest form. Banks aren't insolvent, they're illiquid. They have wealth, but not the specific form of wealth people are demanding right now, this minute, in unlimited quantities. And here's where economic theory collided with reality. Traditional banking wisdom said, if you can't meet withdrawals, you deserve to fail. Markets are self-correcting. Weak institutions should collapse. The system will stabilize naturally. Thornton looked at this logic and saw a death spiral. Because here's what theory missed. When panic is universal, failure becomes contagious. One bank closing triggers runs on others. Each collapse validates the fear driving the panic. Rational individual behavior creates collective catastrophe. The Bank of England, Britain's central bank, was approaching a decision point. Its gold reserves were hemorrhaging. If it continued honoring every withdrawal request, it would run dry within weeks. The orthodox response? Stop lending. Hoard reserves. Protect the institution. The government's response? Suspend gold payments entirely. Make it illegal to exchange notes for gold. This wasn't a theoretical debate. This was late February 1797, and the British financial system had days, perhaps hours, before something irreversible happened. Thornton was a member of Parliament and a director of the Bank of England. He understood both sides, and he proposed something radical. He argued the bank should do the opposite of what instinct demanded. Instead of contracting credit, it should expand it. Instead of hoarding reserves, it should lend aggressively, but strategically, to institutions that were solvent but illiquid, to banks with good assets but temporary cash shortages, to anyone who could provide collateral proving their underlying creditworthiness. The goal wasn't to save bad banks. It was to prevent good banks from collapsing purely because of timing. This sounds obvious now. It wasn't obvious then. Every instinct in traditional banking screamed against it. You don't lend during a panic. You protect yourself. You don't expand your liabilities when your reserves are vanishing. You contract. You don't reward the institutions that couldn't manage their liquidity. You let them fail. Thornton's insight was seeing the system as a system, not just a collection of individual institutions. If the Bank of England, the lender of last resort, refused to lend, then there was no last resort. Every bank would scramble for safety simultaneously. Credit would freeze. Commerce would halt. The economy wouldn't self-correct, it would seize. So the bank suspended gold convertibility exactly as the government ordered. But it didn't stop lending. It became more aggressive. And Thornton spent the next several years writing, arguing, and explaining why this wasn't reckless. It was the only responsible choice. His masterwork, An Inquiry into the Nature and Effects of the Paper Credit of Great Britain, published in 1802, became the intellectual foundation for modern central banking. Not because it was popular, because it was right. Here's what Thornton understood that almost nobody else did at the time. Money isn't just gold. It's confidence. When people trust the system, paper notes function as money. When trust collapses, only gold counts. But if you try to back every note with gold during a panic, you guarantee collapse, because panic is infinite and gold is finite. The solution isn't more gold. It's restoring confidence. And confidence requires visible, credible intervention. The Bank of England's decision to lend aggressively while suspending gold payments sent a signal. We will not let solvent institutions fail due to temporary liquidity problems. We will support the system. Slowly, panic receded. Not immediately. Fear doesn't evaporate overnight. But the hemorrhaging stopped. Banks stabilized. Credit resumed flowing. Britain survived. The financial system survived. And Thornton's logic became embedded in how central banks think about crises. But here's what makes his story remarkable. He got almost nothing for it. Thornton wasn't celebrated. He wasn't rewarded with higher office or financial gain. His ideas were adopted quietly, reluctantly, and without much acknowledgement. Why? Because he violated sacred principles. He argued that markets don't always self-correct, that individual rationality can produce collective disaster, that the state must sometimes intervene not to control the economy, but to prevent it from consuming itself. These ideas made him suspect to free market purists. They made him dangerous to those who believed financial discipline required pain. They made him forgettable to a society that preferred its heroes to fit cleaner narratives. Thornton also understood something else, something that makes his thinking uncomfortable even today. Moral hazard is real, but not the biggest risk. Yes, if you always rescue failing institutions, you encourage recklessness. People take bigger risks if they know they'll be saved. But if you never intervene, you don't get discipline. You get cascading collapse. You get 1930s-style depressions where the entire economy contracts because nobody will lend, nobody will spend, and everybody hoards. Thornton's solution wasn't to eliminate consequences. It was to distinguish between insolvency and illiquidity. Let the insolvent fail. Save the illiquid. But do it quickly, credibly, and without hesitation. This framework still underpins modern central banking. The Federal Reserve's response in 2008. The European Central Bank's interventions during the sovereign debt crisis. Whatever it takes isn't recklessness. It's Thornton's logic applied at scale. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Thornton himself recognized the danger in his own solution. If the state can always intervene, then discipline erodes. If banks know they'll be rescued, they gamble more. If governments know central banks will finance deficits, they borrow excessively. Thornton believed in rules. He believed in limits. He believed central banks should lend freely during crises, but at penalty rates. High enough to discourage abuse, low enough to stop panic. The principle is elegant. The practice is brutal, because in real crises, determining who is a liquid versus insolvent is nearly impossible. Assets collapse in value. Credit dries up. What looked sound yesterday looks toxic today. Do you lend and risk rewarding failure? Or do you refuse and risk triggering contagion? Thornton didn't claim to have perfect answers. He claimed to have better questions. And his most important question remains unresolved. How do you build a system that's stable enough to survive panic, but disciplined enough to prevent recklessness? Every generation wrestles with this. 2008 showed what happens when discipline fails and risks accumulate. The response showed what happens when central banks follow Thornton's playbook. And the aftermath showed what happens when rescue becomes expectation. We're still living inside Thornton's framework. We just don't call it that. When central banks cut rates during recessions, that's Thornton. When they provide emergency lending facilities, that's Thornton. When they expand their balance sheets to prevent credit freezes, that's Thornton. But here's what most people miss. Thornton never intended this to be permanent policy. He designed emergency medicine, not daily vitamins. The system was supposed to return to normal after crises. Rates were supposed to rise. Balance sheets were supposed to shrink. Discipline was supposed to reassert itself. That hasn't happened. Not fully. Not consistently. Because once you demonstrate that intervention works, the political pressure to keep intervening becomes overwhelming. Once you prove you can prevent collapse, every slowdown becomes an emergency. Every correction becomes a crisis. Every adjustment becomes unacceptable. Thornton's framework assumed crises were rare. Our economy treats them as inevitable. And this is where his story becomes a warning, not just history. Thornton saved Britain by breaking the rules, but he never stopped believing in rules. He thought intervention should be exceptional, temporary, and accompanied by penalty rates that discouraged dependence. Modern central banking kept the intervention. It discarded the penalties. It made the exception into policy. The question we face now isn't whether Thornton was right in 1797. He clearly was. The question is whether a system designed for rare emergencies can function when emergencies become routine. Can you maintain financial stability without eventually undermining the discipline that stability requires? Thornton would say no, that eventually the system corrodes. That rescue without consequence breeds recklessness. That you can delay crises, but you can't eliminate the underlying forces that cause them. History hasn't proven him wrong yet. It's just taken longer than he might have expected. Henry Thornton didn't invent central banking, but he gave it the intellectual framework that still governs crisis response today. And in doing so, he created a tool powerful enough to save economies and dangerous enough to distort them. The tragedy is we remember the tool, but not the man who warned us how to use it. If this changed how you see modern finance, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to look.